The purpose of this meeting today is kind of to recap or rerun the meeting that we had in November. On November 14th, we ran exactly the same meeting. The same content is covered both times. This is another courtesy possibility for people to see this content again if you weren't able to see it on the webinar or be here in person last time. We're going to go through the history of the project over the last now 11 years and then wind up with where we are today at planning. So after that, we'll discuss the next steps, where we go from here, and then we will have some time at the end for questions and comments. Please do hold your comments and questions until after we've finished the presentation. We have a lot of slides to get through. So the agenda in general is first to do a round of introductions for the staff for OPRD, for TEP, and for ESA. And I'll start off, again, I'm Noel Batchelor, I'm with State Parks, and I will now pass on the mic here. This one working? Okay.
Hey everyone, Colin Jones, Habitat Assessment and Monitoring Program Manager with the Tillamook Estuaries Partnership.
Hi everyone, I'm Hunter White, Civil and Water Resources Engineer with ESA, leading the design of the project.
Good afternoon, Jason Elkins, and I'm the Park Manager at Cape Lookout Management Unit, which includes Sitka, Sedge State Natural Area.
And I'm Chris Leahy. I'm the Public Works Director for Tillamook County.
Great, thanks everyone. All right. Now to transition into the project history recap. I'll start with laying the groundwork, going over where we're talking about and identifying some features on the landscape that we'll be talking about. I think this might be a little far from my mouth. I'll try to get over here. The red boundary that you can see in the map is the state parks property boundary, Sitka Sedge State Natural Area. And as you can see, there's a black line right here, which is the Belts Dike built in the 1930s. Right here, we have Renicky Creek, one of the major fish-bearing streams that's behind the existing dike. Belts Creek here. This green rectangle is the proposed location of the setback dike. And then to the south, here we have a natural stream that we're calling No Name Creek. It doesn't actually have that name officially on the maps, but that's what we've been calling it for lack of a better name. That flows into East Marsh, also not an official name. Then there's the Sand Lake Road Ditch and the Tierra del Mar Ditch. And of course, Tierra del Mar community is right here to the south of the state parks property. To the north of the property is the Sand Lake Estuary. So why? Why are we doing this? Why are we talking about this? First of all, the existing tide gate is actively failing. You can see in the photos here what the existing tide gate looks like. This is a 4x4 approximately concrete box culvert with a vertical hinged flap. The vertical hinged flap used to have planks on it that kept the water from rushing in against or through the dike during high tides. All of those planks are gone now. Sorry everyone. I think I did this last time too. So everything is being a rerun today. Let me see how I can. There's the share button. Okay. Screen 2. All right, sorry about that. I'm going to go back for the benefit of the people on the webinar that weren't able to see the groundwork here. So again, pointing out the features on the map for those on the webinar, the red boundary is the state parks boundary, Sitka Sedge State Natural Area. The black line is the existing Belts Dike constructed in the 1930s. The tide gate in that dike is right here where this call out points. This is Belts Marsh behind the dike. The green rectangle is the proposed setback dike location. Reneke Creek is the northernmost creek flowing into Belts Marsh. Belts Creek is the next one down. No Name Creek here from the south. East Marsh above it, adjacent to Sand Lake Road. Tierra Del Mar Ditch running along Sand Lake Road through Tierra Del Mar. And Tierra Del Mar Ditch up here on the north end of Tierra Del Mar. And the community of Tierra Del Mar to the south of the red park boundary. Sand Lake Estuary is to the north. And now if I can get it to move. Okay. And on this slide, this is the existing tide gate in the 1930s vintage dike. The opening of this concrete box culvert is about 4 foot by 4 foot, and it has a vertical hinged tide gate. This vertical hinged tide gate is missing all of the boards, and so water is able to rush through here like crazy. The amount of water that flushes through this thing during a high tide or a receding water event from stormwater behind the dike is very fast because of how small this hole is in the dike. It's like a fire hose. It's causing all kinds of eddies and bubbles and foam and so on. And what you can see in this picture on the bottom here is that these eddies, because of the excessive speed of the water, have eaten away at the inside of the dike. The dike used to go all the way out here to these wing walls, and it's been eaten away mostly in the last 20 years since the boards on the tide gate flap started to fail. It is not legal to replace the tide gate flap or the tide gate as is because fish passage requirements have changed over the years. This is a 1930s or 1950s vintage. The current standard is for a much larger opening that allows more water to move more slowly and allow fish and better connectivity and equilibration of the water between the sides of the dike. As I said before, the water blasting through here is really fast. That's considered a fish passage barrier to coho and other fish that can't swim against that super high velocity. The other aspect of this dike that is really in need is that the dike has settled. It's old. It's built to a 1930s standard, and it's barely above current king tides, just within inches of current king tides. So it won't take much sea level rise for this to be overtopped. So what has been done over the years? I'm not going to read all of these things here, but a lot of work has been done in the last 11 years on this property in general, and specifically also looking at what the options are for dealing with the situation with the failing dike. The property was acquired in 2014, and shortly thereafter, a lot of planning started to go into effect, including assessments of habitat, of recreation needs, of scenic resources, of cultural resources, everything under the sun. And we really found out early on that there was a real strong need for hydrological analysis. So in 2016 through 2019, we had 2 separate highly detailed hydrological studies that took place that characterized how the water flows inside and outside of the dike, what the effects would be under different alternatives, and how to weigh those alternatives against each other. In 2020, we made a decision to look at the setback dike as the preferred alternative. And then 2020 kind of pulled the rug out from under us. We had no funding for a while there, and we quickly forged this relationship, a great relationship with Tillamook Estuaries Partnership, to look for other ways of funding the project and continue to move it forward. Tillamook Estuaries Partnership was able to receive grant funding that allowed them to pick up the pieces and start to move forward with the planning. And in 2022, we sort of jump-started the whole effort and started moving into design in more detail and with more urgency. Over the last couple of years, we've reached the 30% design stage, which could be called semi-conceptual. We're not at the finish line yet. We're 30% of the way towards the finish line of having finished designs. And that's where we are right now, is 30%. Over the last 11 years, there have been at least 24 now meetings that have been open to the public and advertised. We've also had news releases. We have a website that's actively maintained to show the products of all of the assessments that are being done and the recordings of meetings such as this for people who aren't able to make it in person. We also have an email list sign up on our webpage that allows anyone who would like to be notified of upcoming meetings to put their name on an emailing list. And I encourage anyone who is here that would like to be on that list to join or look at our website and submit their email to that email address. We've also had meetings with adjacent landowners, and we have ongoing collaboration with the Tierra Community Association and with other interested landowners. So over the years, we have assessed a number of general alternatives, each of these with kind of sub-flavors, but on the upper left here, we have the no action or existing condition alternative, which is really the do nothing approach. What would happen if we did nothing? So that's one bookend. On the other side of the spectrum, in the upper right here, we have dike breach. What was hydrology like before there was a dike at all? What would it be like if the dike were breached? That's another bookend. The two action alternatives that we're really most actively pursuing over the last 10 years have been the alternative of replacing the existing tide gate with a modern muted tidal regulator, which is a side hinge type of tide gate that is allowed to stay open for a certain amount of time, but has a closure setting, sort of like the toilet float in your toilet that turns the water off when the water reaches a certain level. This is the same principle that is operative here with a muted tidal regulator. And then the most recent and preferred option at this point is the setback dike option, which is to first construct a setback dike further to the south, which will allow unfettered access for fish and habitat restoration in the majority of the marsh to Belts Creek, Reneke Creek, but to still provide an even higher level of protection to Tierra del Mar using the setback dike as the new flood control structure. And this figure doesn't really show you anything other than the sort of array of different effects that might be expected under different alternatives. What you're seeing in this slide is just an example. There are many different figures that are similar to this that represent different features, but this is showing the frequency of surface water presence in the marsh under each of these different alternatives. In the upper left is the existing condition, then modern tide gate with a 7-foot closure setting or toilet float closure setting. Then we have the 8-foot, 9-foot, 10-foot. We have a breach or pre-dike hydrology assessment of frequency. And then we have the setback dike here with the setback represented by this black bar. And, oops, this is a video that sort of shows that in a graphical, interactive way. I'm going to pause this for a second so that I can explain some of the characteristics of this before it moves too far, if I can. The ads are in the way. Well, I'll just talk fast. In the upper left here, we have the existing condition. This is what's out there right now. The next one over is the modern tide gate with an 8-foot closure setting. This is the breach or the pre-dike hydrology situation. And then the setback dike is represented in the upper right with the setback dike itself shown as this black bar. On the bottom, the current moment in time that's being depicted in these videos at the top is the black bar. And then these curves at the bottom are the tide height level. That is present in each of the different situations. The colors are a little bit hard to read, at least on my screen here, but the green line here is the existing condition. The blue line here is the outside of the dike or the breach situation. And then these truncated ones, the red and maybe purple, are modern tide gate and the setback dike alternatives. The blue shading down here is a major rainfall event, and this is something like a 50-year rain event. It's a pretty significant storm. And these tides are pretty tall tides also. Now, the things that I would point out here in this video is that the existing condition, because of that small 4x4 opening in the dike, is sort of like the hole in an hourglass. So water takes a long time to go in, but it takes a long time to go out at the same time. And so what we're seeing here is that in a situation with a 50-year event, the water stays in for days on end under the existing condition, whereas all of the other alternatives drain out with every tide cycle. You'll see minor differences between these different alternatives here, depending on how high the tide is and how much rain there is. So I'm going to zoom this forward if it will let me, and we can look at a 100-year event. For some reason, these ads are interfering with my ability to move it forward. Well, let me set the stage. This blue shading here is a 100-year rainfall event, a huge, huge rainfall event. It's coupled also with the highest recorded tides that we've seen in our studies, which are about a 12-foot tide, which coincides, coincidentally, with the actual height of the low point of the dike. So as this moves forward into the high tide situation, really wish I could move this forward. Well, we can demonstrate it before. I'll talk about it as it continues to move. I'm sorry, everyone, I'm not able to move it forward because of the YouTube portion here. But now watch this tide here. This is a 10.5-foot tide. Notice that the maximum penetration into private property is highest in the breach scenario, and it's attenuated by both the modern tide gate in the existing dike as well as the setback dike. You'll see in these scenarios that the setback dike actually improves on the hydrology, or the amount of water that reaches Tierra del Mar, significantly relative to the modern tide gate scenario. And again, once we hit this major 100-year storm event, water backs up inside the existing condition, can't get out of that hourglass, and the water stays up for days on end, sometimes overtopping Sand Lake Road at No Name Creek. So here's the 12.2-foot tide. You'll see this penetration up into private property here near Tierra del Mar was maximized under the breach, lesser in the setback dike than in the modern tide gate with an 8-foot setting. That's really all we need to say about that. You can watch that video on YouTube as well. So with that, OPRD's sideboards and goals for this project are fivefold. First of all, the design should result in virtually no increase in stormwater, tidewater, or elevated groundwater in private properties in Tierra del Mar. Second, the design should result in meaningful improvements to the estuary and fish habitats in the area inside the dike. Third, the design should restore fish passage to the mouths of Reneke and Belts Creeks. Recreational access across the marsh should allow visitors to see the marsh up close, reach the beach, and enjoy the diverse coastal environments in between. And the design should route Reneke Creek to the marsh in a natural way, not in a channelized ditch. It's currently in a roadside ditch, and we'll get to that. So a brief summary of the pros and cons of each of these alternatives. the no action alternative, do nothing. There are no pros to this. The dike is failing. It's leaving it alone is not a good idea. The second alternative, dike breach. Well, this would have a very high estuarine benefit for fish and so on, but it does not meet OPRD goals because it would result in more surface water on private property. So that one is out. The third one, modern tide gates in the existing dike. This one has moderate level of fish benefit, has a moderate level of estuarine restoration benefit, but not as much as the setback dike alternative. The setback dike alternative offers sort of the best approximation of a win-win for both protecting the community and private property and also providing for unfettered fish passage to Belts Creek, Reneke Creek, and for juvenile fish to move throughout the system in the area north of the setback dike. In 2020, the state parks leadership, after hearing testimony from the technical team in 2019, there was a technical team series of meetings, 4 meetings in which representatives for various resource interests like fish or neighborhood and community infrastructure, engineering, public works. There were a variety of people involved in the technical team meetings of 2019. And that group really heard testimony and assessed wide-ranging impacts of each of the alternatives to try to provide a good picture of which one of these really makes the most sense. Shortly thereafter, we met with the Tillamook County Commissioners and with the Oregon State Parks Commission, and then later with the Oregon State Parks executive leadership, and ultimately executive leadership of state parks selected the setback dike as the alternative to pursue moving forward. This decision was made in the spring of 2020, and since then, or shortly thereafter, we received a letter of support to aid in getting grants from the Tierra del Mar Community Association and started to try to move this forward through design. And of course, COVID hit, funding fell apart, and we lost some momentum. Fortunately, Tillamook Estuaries Partnership was able to come to the rescue and really pick up this project and move it forward. So after 2020, after Tillamook Estuaries Partnership came into the program, they were able to get a grant and hire a consultant, Environmental Science Associates, and you'll hear from Hunter here soon on the different elements of design that could be incorporated into this project. And just to get to those in a real basic sense, this slide here is looking south towards Tierra del Mar from Sand Lake, and it shows an array of potential setback dike locations. This was sort of like it was necessary to assess a bunch of different options to figure out which one worked best. You don't know off the top of your head which one's going to work until you model it and try it. And so there were an array of different options here that were assessed, ultimately ending up with a selection that you'll see in a coming slide. Also, as part of that, Environmental Science Associates and Tillamook Estuaries Partnership did an assessment of surface water and groundwater issues in the community of Tierra del Mar. This is outside of OPRD's scope, but it may be of interest to members of the community. This is available out there as a resource for community members to look at and work towards potential partnerships to do something about these low topographic areas with no positive drainage in Tierra del Mar. These orange and red areas here shown on the map are areas that are concave. They hold water. They don't have any ditches to allow the water out. So this is kind of this is a side issue that OPRD is not involved in, but TEP and ESA have done work on this. So I just wanted to mention that to let you know that it's out there. So this is the process I was referring to earlier of trying to figure out where exactly the setback dike should go. And I've been calling this tapping on the wall to find the stud. You know, is this the right spot? Not here. Is this the right spot? No. You keep going until you find one that actually meets your project goals. And in our case, the project goals, the things that we're really looking for are both minimizing the size of the setback dike, how big of a footprint it has on the land, as well as maximizing or having a sufficient basin size behind the setback dike for stormwater storage in the times when the dike has to be closed. So there would be a muted tidal regulator here in the setback dike that would close during times when the tide is high. And during that time with that's closed, stormwater during a big rainfall event would pool up behind the setback dike. So if the setback dike is too close to Tierra del Mar, the water levels will raise. But if it's far enough north, there's enough basin size there that the water levels won't rise significantly, and you'll have enough room to hold all of that stormwater during the few hours that the setback dike's muted tidal regulator is closed. So alternative one, which is this one up here, the furthest north, and also very close to the original location assessed in 2019 and 2020. That one is the only one that meets the goals. It's got more than enough basin size to store stormwater, and it's as far south as you can go to minimize that, that footprint size. It also allows unfettered fish passage access to Belts and Reneke creeks, and sort of maximizes the amount of estuarine restoration that can happen north of the setback dike. So the effects on habitat are manyfold. The setback dike itself is about a 1.5 acre footprint structure in the alternative one location. That's about as small as we could get it using this approach of finding that sweet spot between sufficient storage basin and moving it south. The project would restore about 70 acres of natural estuarine conditions north of that setback dike to the ecology that would have been present there prior to the 1930s when the Belts dike was constructed. About 78% of the habitat behind the historic Belts dike would be restored, and 85% of the marsh that is within the state park boundaries would be restored to natural estuary. Higher tides along the north of the setback dike would also provide fish and aquatic wildlife foraging and rearing habitat. So it's not all about fish passage, it's also about the habitat itself north of the setback dike. And that low salt marsh and marsh habitat that's natural estuary north of the setback dike is really essential for juvenile fish. And lastly, there is some thinking around natural estuaries being more resilient to sea level rise. The sediment that comes in with incoming tides gets deposited in layers over time. That deposit of sediment allows the marsh to kind of grow upward as sea levels increase. In terms of the changes on habitat that are present inside the marsh right now, this graphic shows the types of marsh and types of vegetation that would be expected under the existing condition. This is what's observed in 2016 versus in the setback dike situation. So what we see here in this light colored green is freshwater marsh, and this pink color is high salt marsh. And then there's some scrub shrub wetland here in blue and forested wetland in green. And you'll see that with the breaching of the exterior dike, the landscape really shifts more towards the historic condition, which was low salt marsh with high salt marsh and freshwater marsh pushed more to the edges. When the dike was fully functional and the tide gate was fully functional originally in 1930s up until the 1990s, this area didn't get very much tidewater, and so it was able to transition during that time to a freshwater system instead of a saltwater system. And now with the breach of the exterior dike, that would return to more of a saltwater habitat. And just in another way of viewing that, you can see the winners and losers on these different habitat types here. Low salt marsh is a big winner under the setback dike condition, and the freshwater marsh decreases because there's more salt water there as a result of the breach in the exterior dike. In terms of the condition of the marsh that would be impacted by the setback dike, you can see here the color scheme. The greener it is, the more pristine, the redder, the less pristine. And in this case, most of the setback dike is it's in pretty good condition habitat right now. So it's not insignificant that we'd be plonking a dike on top of this marsh habitat. But at the same time, it does pass through some low quality weed infested areas in the marsh. In terms of effects to private property, really the take home here is the setback dike alternative decreases the amount of surface water that would reach private properties on the north end of Tierra del Mar significantly over definitely the pre-1939 dike construction, and also relative to the existing conditions. And this is because of that hourglass effect. So also, in some ways, the construction of the setback dike and breaching the exterior dike is self-mitigating in a way, in that the green areas here would be estuary gain. If you look at these hydrographs at the bottom, these curves are showing the height of the tide. The blue is outside of the dike, and the orange is inside of the dike under current conditions. And what you see is the tide doesn't reach as high under the existing conditions, but under a scenario with a breach here and a setback dike here, these green areas would be re-wetted by allowing more water to get in there. And then that kind of compensates for the loss of 1.5 acres of habitat that would be lost from the placement of the setback dike here. So next steps. Geotechnical boring is key to figuring out how to construct and where to construct and the details of the engineering for the project. And that has been something that we've been trying to get in place for quite a while now. We need to take the designs from 30% all the way to the finish line on design. We need to find out more about permittability. There are a lot of regulations around this kind of thing, as you can imagine. And there are a lot of things that need to be figured out about how and when to apply for the various permits and what the hurdles would be to be able to move through that permitting process. And we need new grants. We currently have grant funding to get us to 100% design. We don't have any money yet for implementation. So we'll be applying for funds to take this through to actual construction, should we get to a stage where we're permitted, the designs look good, and all of that. And with that, I will pass the mic over to Hunter. You want to hold it? All right.
Hi, everybody. Again, my name is Hunter White, Civil and Water Resources Engineer with ESA. Represent a team much larger than myself with not only other staff from ESA, fisheries biologists, landscape architects, folks that are working on the permitting process right now, as well as other sub-consultants. We have David Evans Associates providing roadway and structural engineering, and Shannon and Wilson, a geotechnical engineer on our team, and others as well. So Noel just gave a great summary of what's gone on over the last, nearly 10 years working on this project. And, as he said, there's been now 24 meetings open to the public on this project. So today is essentially a repeat of a presentation we gave back in November. So there has been additional progress made since then, but this is really trying to replay the content we gave back in November. So as Noel said, we are now at the 30% design stage of the project. Typically, we start the permitting process now, and when we get to the 60% level of design, we'll start submitting permit applications and moving much closer towards construction. So this was back in fall of last year, 2023, that we did finish 30% design. That phase of the project included a very thorough, detailed alternatives analysis, both of where should the setback dike be, how large should the dike breach be, and other considerations around the locations and dimensions of these features. As I said, we've got a team of other engineering and environmental subconsultants working on this project. So Noel showed you a version of this graphic which showed more of the alternatives that we were considering. This is the version now where we've honed in a bit more, we've narrowed down these options. And what you see here is starting at the bottom, which is the north, next to Sand Lake, we're showing a breach of that existing dike. I'll talk a bit more about that in a second and zoom in on each one of these elements as I walk through the content here. Breaching this, I guess the arrow doesn't show up there. Breaching the dike, and in order to maintain trail access, I'm sure a lot of you know this is a very popular trail. It's great access to get out to the beach and incredible trail network in the forested dune area. In order to maintain that access while breaching the dike, we're proposing to span the breach with a pedestrian bridge. And I'll show you a little bit more detail on that in just a moment. As Noel mentioned, with that dike breach, we're now providing fish access into Renicky Creek and into Belts Creek. And you can see the proposed location of the setback dike now shown in the orange bar across the south end of the marsh. It would tie into Sand Lake Road on the east side. It would tie into that forested dune on the west side. With that, we do still have No Name Creek coming in behind the dike, the setback dike, and the other drainages shown, the Sand Lake Road ditch and the Tierra del Mar north ditch, as we've referred to it, that carries stormwater from Tierra del Mar into this area that will be behind the setback dike. This is another view of kind of the same thing. This is starting to get into our construction drawings that we're developing. This is from the 30% plans. And again, at the north end, showing the dike breach and a pedestrian bridge, the setback dike across the south end of the marsh. And those are really the two main elements of the project at this point. And I'll get into some of the other pieces of the project that are being combined in as we move the entire project forward through permitting and final design. So zooming in here now at the dike breach location, the existing dike, the trail that we all walk on now to view the estuary out to the north and the wetland to the south. We're showing here about a 200-foot wide breach excavated through this dike. And what we're looking at in the plans here are our grading contours of how we would excavate through that earthen embankment and creating a new channel to convey water in and out of the marsh, and really trying to restore a historical channel that used to be in this location to connect Belts Marsh to Sand Lake. You can see at the bottom there, that's a profile view along the dike and showing this 200-foot span pedestrian bridge. This, in the next phase of work here, we're working with our structural bridge engineers, Oregon State Parks, our geotechnical engineers, and additional hydraulic modeling to further refine the size of this breach and the size of the bridge itself, which I know there were, here's just a couple examples of what this bridge could look like. We're considering prefabricated bridge options to be kind of the most economical approach to a bridge of this size. And again, like I said, we've got some upcoming meetings to work with state parks about the aesthetics, the material choices here, and really what do we want this bridge to look like? And then working on some of the other engineering aspects to figure out, how big can it be? What are the cost trade-offs for the different sizes of bridge options? And then what sort of foundation is required, the abutments that the bridge will sit on, and, most likely deep piles that will extend, up to 80 feet below ground to tie into solid foundation. So as I said, we're still refining exactly the size of this breach. And this is just a look at some analysis we did in the last phase of work, comparing a 100-foot dike breach versus a 200-foot dike breach. And when we've in the earlier stage of the project, in 2019, we were describing a 40-foot breach, which was actually a 40-foot bottom width of the channel. And when you carry side slopes up to where it would intersect with the top of the dike, that would have been about an 80-foot wide breach at the top. And so what we're looking at here is essentially a 100-foot breach, just a little bit bigger than that original concept, which is shown here on the left, and a 200-foot wide breach that's shown on the right. This is a moment within the model where water is rushing in under a king tide event. So one of the most extreme moments of water rushing in through this new breach. And what we see here on the left, this is actually a view out of our HECRAS model, where you can see the water coming in and really circling around, eddying around. And that's similar to the effect that we see with the existing culvert that's there, which can have a tendency to cause erosion. And so, that's one reason why we're looking to, increase the size of that breach until we start to see that erosive effect go away. And on the right there with the 200-foot breach, that eddy feature, that swirling of water is dissipated. The velocities would be lower with a larger breach, which would also lead to less potential for erosion and less need to armor the banks beneath that bridge. Pardon me. Another consideration is, we don't want to make this breach and bridge too small. And this is our one shot to do it right. And so we really don't want to undershoot it. This is an example that we are looking at as a reference, Nisqually Wildlife Refuge near Tacoma, Olympia area. And you can see here, this is progression through time. From 2011, they did a similar project where they reconnected this tidal marsh, breached the channel, or created a breach channel and put in a 40-foot span pedestrian bridge over that channel. About 8 years later in 2019, that channel was trying to enlarge itself just by all that water rushing in and out. And you can kind of see in the image there were some attempts to stabilize that bank and save the bridge that they'd put in. But they eventually realized that that was a losing battle, and that small bridge foundation was being undermined. Here in 2020, they ended up replacing that bridge only 9 years after they originally built it, and went from a 40-foot span up to a 90-foot span. So again, really taking this as a lesson learned that we don't want to undershoot the size of this bridge and dike breach. Another example that's closer to home here is the Whalen Island Bridge. And this bridge was replaced, with a much larger structure. The bridge that got put in here is about an 80-foot span. And what you can see here, though, is that the banks around around these bridge foundations and the entire channel beneath it is heavily armored with riprap. And that's because the size of the bridge that was selected there does allow great connectivity and allows full connectivity and equalizing of the water levels on either side. But when the water is moving through that opening at peak drain out moments, the velocities are very high. This riprap is necessary to protect the bridge from erosion. So again, just another example of not wanting to undersize our bridge at Sitka Sedge. Next, zooming in a bit on the setback dike itself. And, again, this is kind of a colorized or cartoonized version of our construction drawings. A plan view on the top end there. And again, like I said, we're connecting to Sand Lake Road on the east side. On the west side, we're tying into that forested dune. This would have a gravel access road on top of it to allow for access, monitoring, and maintenance of the tide gate structure that would be located right in the center at the existing channel. One key feature here and really played a lot into our thinking about where to propose to locate the setback dike is the existing beaver dam. There is a prominent beaver dam out there that's been there. It's persistent. We have been thinking about as Noel was showing some other options where we push that setback dike further south, it's really in an area that's impounded by these beaver dams. And so one of our ideas here is we're locating the setback dike not only in an area that has enough storage to contain all of the stormwater from Tierra del Mar, but also in a manner that will keep the setback dike north of that beaver dam and essentially let that southern 10 acres stay as they are and maintain that freshwater marsh and that beaver pond complex that's there. In addition to, like Noel said, just optimizing the location that has enough storage, but minimizes the footprint and wetland impact associated with this new earthen embankment. The bottom is a profile view. So if you cut a cross section along the center line of that dike, and now looking at the bottom, we're seeing that elevation view or profile view. So you can see we're tying in here on the west side into that forested dune, proposing a top elevation of the setback dike at 15 feet. And that would be kind of in its future condition after settlement. We would actually build it at least a couple feet higher than that, 17 feet or so, and then allow over the next 50 years plus, we would expect settlement, but we don't want that dike to ever end up lower than 15 feet. And what that would do, that's providing about 3 feet of freeboard or extra height over the highest tides that we see now, and allows for future sea level rise and just additional capacity to protect against high tides. Another feature that's showing up here, we have a couple of additional culverts, kind of backup culverts, just redundancy in the drainage structures here, so that if there ever were a situation where, we did get beaver debris blocking the main tide gate, we would have these extra culverts that would drain that stormwater off to prevent high waters from reaching Tierra del Mar. So, as Noel described, like that's a very important goal, key goal for this project is to provide not only equivalent, but better level of flood protection and drainage function for Tierra del Mar. This is a cross section of the setback dike and describes a couple of the things I was just mentioning. We're showing that the black line in there at a 15-foot top elevation. That's what we would expect, no lower than that long-term in the future. But in order to achieve that, now we would build the dike at least a couple feet higher in order to accommodate that settlement over long-term. We're showing 5-to-1 pretty flat side slopes, and just for comparison, the existing dike out there, there's locations that are 1-to-1, 1 foot horizontal to 1 foot vertical, or 100% slope. So we're showing much flatter side slopes there. Where this new earth embankment will cross the marsh, there will be a need to stabilize the subgrade, the soil that's beneath it, and prepare it in a way that will counteract some of that settlement. But again, we do expect settlement to occur, and we'll overbuild the dike to accommodate that. The blue line across this image is that 12-foot water level, which is the current peak tide that's observed in Sand Lake. So you can see a couple things here. On the outboard side, the connected side, the north side towards Sand Lake, that 12-foot water level is only going about halfway up the dike embankment. And again, we've got a lot of extra capacity there to I guess we refer to that as freeboard. We have extra height to accommodate that high water and even more to prepare the dike for long-term future sea level rise and other potential, storm surges and things like that. So zooming in on the tide gate structure itself, as I showed you, right in the middle of the setback dike, there's the main channel, kind of central channel within Belts Marsh. And this is zooming in on this tide gate structure. Right now, we are proposing a 12-foot wide box culvert it would essentially be a concrete box culvert type of structure with head walls and wing walls on both sides. And you can see the location relative to that main beaver dam. That's an existing beaver dam that's out there now. And that's that's another consideration for us, just thinking into the future about making sure this structure stays functional. We will likely need to exclude beaver from this immediate location, likely with some sort of exclusion fencing or other methods. We're working with ODFW right now to make sure that we are meeting fish passage criteria, while also the ability to keep beavers out of this structure and tide gate to keep them from blocking it. And here's just another view. This is a profile view through our channel. So if we look at the tide gate structure, just imagine cutting a line straight up and down and then tilting that sideways and looking at this in profile view, as we refer to it. So again, you can see the slopes of the setback dike and the kind of the box culvert structure there. This shows a lot of detail. Again, this is a look at our construction drawings. Yeah, probably a lot of extra information, not necessarily relevant to you all and your view of this, but again, just showing you a glimpse of some of the engineering level of detail that we're at right now. As Noel mentioned, geotechnical engineering is a big aspect to not only the setback dike, but the tide gate structure as well. This is something we have scheduled for late March and early April. We'll have a geotechnical investigation that will be collecting deep borings both on Sand Lake Road and on the existing dike to look at what is the soil and the layers of soils and sediments beneath the ground. This is actually a profile of the geology at the Whalen Island Bridge. Shannon and Wilson is the geotechnical engineer on our team, and they also worked on that project. So we expect our conditions to be very similar to this, but we don't know until we do some investigation and additional drilling. But what you can see here, these colored layers, the green layer at the top is fill. That was the embankment that Whalen Island Road is on. These three layers beneath that, the yellow, brown, and orange, those are layers of essentially mud deposits that have sand and mud deposits that have developed over time, thousands of years. And below that in the gray, that's where we start to get into rock, actual bedrock. And so what this is showing, and at Whalen Island Bridge as well, in order to support that new bridge, piles were driven down deep to be founded on bedrock. We expect that for the pedestrian bridge, for Reneke Creek Bridge, well, I'll talk about here in a second as well. So as I mentioned, beaver and their heavy activity and their presence right near this proposed tide gate structure is a big consideration for us. And beaver are there right now. They will likely remain at Sitka Sedge after the reconnection. Beavers are often more thought of as freshwater, located in freshwater environments, but there is a lot of growing research now that are finding beavers in these estuary areas and in brackish water conditions. And so beavers do plug culverts, as I'm sure a lot of you know, and can cause a lot of problems especially when culverts are too small and easy to block. And that has a lot of big implications on drainage function and flooding, of course, of areas upstream of those blocked culverts. Not only that, but just implications on the maintenance that will be required on this structure long into the future. At least annual or monthly inspections of somebody going out and taking a look and likely removing debris. There are beaver exclusion systems that are pretty simple in some cases, where we just need to keep beaver from accessing these structures and not allowing them to carry dam building materials to block these systems. This is an example of a beaver exclusion device by Beaver Deceivers International, or Skip Lyle, who's also on our team for this project. We had Skip out here back in November to look at the system, and he's on our team to work on a beaver exclusion system for these crossings. So in addition to the big pieces of infrastructure, we're also looking at other ways to enhance habitat conditions within the marsh. Often when we approach these projects and we see ditch networks that have been excavated through these wetlands, and a lot of the original tidal channels have been filled and use these areas as pasture. So typically we look at filling those drainage ditches and re-excavating new sinuous tidal channels. We are considering that here, but as Noel showed a vegetation map, the vegetation out in the marsh is really high quality. And while there will be some changes in plant communities with the reconnection of more salt water, getting out there to fill these ditches or dig new channels or put in wood habitat structures would have an impact on the marsh. And so we're kind of trying to weigh that and balance that right now. How much do we want to get out into that wet area and do these activities? And is it worth the impact that it will cause? So this is just a kind of almost a concept of filling some of the drainage ditches, putting in logs, root wads for good fish habitat, and trying to kind of more naturalize the channel network that's out there. So including within our design, upsizing the drainage culvert at Roma Ave on the Sand Lake Road ditch. So this is the one culvert within Tierra del Mar that is within the zone of influence of tides and elevated water levels that can back up from the marsh. And with the setback dike, we will be reducing those water levels. So we won't actually see these same high water levels, but the Roma Ave culvert, like I said, is the one structure that's within this zone of influence and is kind of low-hanging fruit to replace this culvert, upsize it, and improve the drainage of that ditch. This is a photo from 2017. And what you can see in the two images, the one on the right is the downstream end, the outlet of that culvert. You can see it's actually free flowing. It's not backed up. It doesn't have water, backing it up, blocking it. But on the upstream end, it is impounded. And so, part of it could be some blockages within that culvert or just the size of it itself, not allowing that water to get through fast enough. And so, again, we are proposing to upsize that culvert. Here is a profile, I guess, of that ditch line and showing the Roma Ave culvert kind of right in the middle. And so these are showing some 12-foot and 13-foot water levels and how they just start to interact with that culvert. And we would be proposing to put in about a 3-foot diameter pipe, about doubling the size. All of that work I just described is part of the, what at that time we were having it packaged as the Sitka Sedge Tidal Wetland Restoration Project. And this is a construction cost estimate that includes those elements: the dike breach, the pedestrian bridge, the setback dike, the new tide gate structure, upsizing the Roma Ave culvert, and other pieces as well. Looking right around $6.5 million for all of that work. And that bottom line there is a 30% contingency. And that's just because of the early stage of design that we're at right now. We're adding about 30% just to create some buffer for things to change and evolve as we figure out more about the geotechnical conditions and so forth.
There's nothing in this about removing the old structure. The intention to remove the old dike?
The whole dike, or? Yeah, I guess the question was within this estimate and list of activities and in the content I just talked through, I didn't mention the old culvert that's there now and the rest of the dike. So most of that dike, the existing dike, will stay in place. We'll just create a gap or a breach that will put the pedestrian bridge over. And the existing culvert that's there, that's failing and having erosion around it, that will be removed. And so that concrete structure will be taken out and the embankment will be rebuilt because that will be part of the trail. That's The trail goes over that section now. And so when we take that structure out, we will need to rebuild the embankment in that area to make sure that it'll be stable for the long term for the trail. No, and that's, that's really, so, kind of Noel lightly touched on some of the other alternatives we considered. But we were also at one point thinking, of removing a larger portion of the existing dike and possibly running a boardwalk across that area. And, to be honest, that's not totally off the table as we enter this next stage of permitting right now. We have a lot of conversations going on with ODFW, Department of State Lands, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and Tillamook County. This project will need to comply with Tillamook County's comprehensive plan and land use requirements. And so we need to go through this process and make sure that what we're showing in this design is all permittable. And so yes, but that's at this point, we're keeping the rest of the dike in its current location. That trail will stay as it is. And there will just be a location in the middle of that dike where there will be a pedestrian bridge. Yeah, of course. Thanks for the question. So another aspect of this area, not necessarily the park itself, which, the Sitka Sedge Tidal Wetland Project has been fully located within the park. We've also been working with Tillamook County Public Works, and Chris Lady's here in case questions come up on this aspect of the project, to replace the culvert crossings on Sand Lake Road. There are the three creeks that Noel mentioned. Renicky Creek is the largest one and the kind of the highest fish use or fish potential. So here, looking at the map, we've got Renicky Creek in the north, Belts Creek in the center of the project area, and No Name Creek coming in from the south near Tierra del Mar. We worked under a separate contract directly with Tillamook County Public Works to take the Renicky Creek culvert replacement to a 30% level of design. Again, I mentioned our sub-consultants. We also work with David Evans and Associates, roadway and bridge engineers on that phase of the project as well. And now, as this project is moving forward to final design, we've combined it all together. We're combining it for efficiency to include everything in a single plan set, a single package of documentation, and try to permit it all together to the extent that makes sense. There may be, as we work through the permitting process, other reasons or funding availability may allow Renicky Creek to be built first. But at this point, we've kind of combined it all together because these creeks and the wetland and all of the hydrology is so related that we wanted to really analyze the whole system together. So here's a couple photos of Renicky Creek itself at the crossing, and looking at. So I'll talk mostly about Renicky Creek. And as I said, we worked under a separate contract to get Renicky to 30% design. We are starting now to work on Belts Creek and No Name Creek culvert replacements, but now I'll talk specifically about Renicky Creek. So Renicky Creek, forested hillside from the east and flows down towards Sand Lake Road. Where it hits Sand Lake Road, there is a culvert there. But that culvert has been blocked, filled with gravels. Renicky Creek carries large amounts of gravel from the steeper stream section and will deposit that gravel into the creek channel. And in this case, completely buried the culvert that used to convey much of the creek across Sand Lake Road. Right now, the creek actually flows down the roadside ditch. And it comes down to the low point in the landscape and the low point in Sand Lake Road. If you drive through this area, there's a pretty obvious dip location, and that area overtops. And the culvert there is only 24 inches in diameter, so frequently overtops and just doesn't have the capacity to convey all that water. Water will overtop the roadway, and that is really a driver for not only the infrastructure aspect of the project, but for fish passage as well. That very small pipe doesn't really allow fish movement into the upper portion of Reneke Creek. So stepping back, we really wanted to see, where does it make sense to replace the culvert? Where do we want to put a new bridge, a new crossing structure? And so we looked back through time, and going all the way back to 1939, and maybe for orientation, actually, I'll start on the right side, which is more like what it looks like today. You can see the narrow band of riparian or tree vegetation along the creek there where it approaches Sand Lake Road. And this triangular patch of forest that's still out there, refer to that as the forested wetland. You'll hear me talk about that a few times. The blue dashed line, that's an old channel of Reneke Creek, and that was excavated along with the construction of the dike. Reneke Creek was channelized and routed around the east end of the dike, flowing through a culvert there to get it out to Sand Lake. Not only the culvert has filled in, but that channel has also filled in over time because of these gravel deposits that come downstream. This orange circle or oval there is really just looking at the different channels that used to be there in 1939, some of the original tidal channels and branches of Reneke Creek that used to cross through that area. In the 50s, you can see, with construction of the dike and draining off of that land, those channels were filled. That area was used for agriculture, for grazing. And then you can also see just the change in vegetation of that forested area over time. Reneke Creek used to, flow through this large forested area. And, by the time we reached the 1970s, most of that forested area had been cleared, and Reneke Creek really boxed into that single threaded channel that it sits in still today. This is some kind of zooming out more, really looking at the overall function of the geomorphology of Reneke Creek, or how does water and sediment behave in Reneke Creek, both under its natural condition as well as today. And the top image there, this is a kind of a conceptual graphic of a feature called an alluvial fan. This is when water and sediment comes out of the steep hillside, it hits the flat ground of kind of the flat plain there, and it spreads out. It drops that gravel, like I mentioned, and over the thousands of years, the creek channel will fill in, it will shift into a new location, more gravel will be deposited, filling that channel, the creek will shift in over again, and over time, the creek kind of fans out in this broad kind of radial feature, through this process of just filling in the channel, relocating that channel. The bottom left here is a LiDAR image of the Reneke Creek area, and you can really see that fan feature. The blue, kind of the light blue line there is tracing Reneke Creek's current path. And what you can see is over that amount of time and the development of this area, Reneke Creek has kind of been pushed over to one side of that alluvial fan. And I guess as I was showing here in this image, through the progression of development and clearing, Reneke Creek has further been boxed into this location. So this is a hydraulic model, again, looking at how water behaves during high flows on Reneke Creek. And what we see is, even under existing conditions, when high water moves through the system, it overtops the banks and it flows across that floodplain down to that low point in this forested wetland. So you can see kind of that location where the creek hits the road, takes this hard left turn and flows down the roadside ditch. All that water eventually ends up in the low point of the landscape. And so in addition to that, within that forested wetland triangle there, we see these existing flow paths or old channels that Reneke Creek used to flow through, and in fact still does. When high flows overtop the banks of the channel, a lot of this water still ends up flowing down here into these flow paths that are still there today. This is some photos in that forested wetland, and you can see traces of the old creek channel that still carry water today. And so our concept for restoring Reneke Creek and replacing the culvert that's there is a combination of elements here. We're trying to get that creek out of that roadside ditch and allow it to flow across this area that used to be forested, diverting the creek away from that road, flowing across this area, revegetating it to try to recreate the conditions that were historically there. And with that alluvial fan type of feature, creeks aren't usually just in a single channel. They are usually spread out into multiple side channels. And that's something we're also going to try to recreate. You know, along with that, you know, the big element here for improving access, transportation along Sand Lake Road is putting in a new bridge where that small culvert is now. I'll show you a little bit more detail on that, but this is showing that we would also raise Sand Lake Road up by a couple of feet to reduce that low point, the potential for overtopping, and just to have a more resilient road in this location. So again, a little look at the engineering drawings, but this is the roadway design at 30%, which is showing a raising up of that road. And then this is a look at the bridge itself. So replacing that small culvert with a 49-foot span bridge. So quite an upsizing, and not only to provide great fish passage, but also to be able to pass gravels and pass wood debris and prevent that from being blocked, as well as giving that freeboard, that extra vertical space there to adapt to future water levels and high flows and debris passage. So this being a separate project, all of that work there that I just described, the raising of the road, the new bridge, and the stream restoration work, we're estimating at about $3 million for that work. The county has applied for Federal Highways Administration grant funding in partnership with Trout Unlimited and Tillamook Estuaries Partnership and the Salmon Superhighway Partnership. And oh yeah, I guess that's the end of the content. You know, as I said, we've continued to work on the project since November when this presentation took place, and we are now starting designs on Belts Creek and No Name Creek culvert replacements, as well as really engaging with the permitting agencies, starting to advance this project more towards a 60% design and preparing to submit permit applications. So with that, we'll open it up to questions.
Maybe we can quickly address a couple of questions that came in from our online participants. They've been waiting for, some of them over an hour here. So the first question is about the grant funding. And maybe this is the best question for Tillamook Estuaries Partnership. It says, is the grant funding still in place, or is it among the grants from the federal government that may be canceled?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Obviously, federal grant funding is a question that's been top of mind. The short and sweet answer to that is there was a short period where we didn't have access to those funds, but access to those funds has been restored. And so we are continuing to move forward as is. The funds have already been allocated and should be available for this project. For design, yes, we have not yet secured grant funding for construction or implementation. Yep, so we have a current NOAA grant that funds to 100% designs and permitting.
Okay, and then the next question from the online participants is, there's a lot of water buildup in Tierra del Mar on the east side of Sand Lake Road, yet no culverts nor proper drainage. Is it possible to include funding to get culverts for that side of Sand Lake Road for Tierra del Mar? To me, this sounds like it's partially addressed potentially by the No Name Creek crossing. And I don't know if any of your ESA DEP assessment on low points and Tierra del Mar drainage patterns would address that question.
See if I can pull a slide here. Well, maybe this one here. And, so it sounds like they're talking about the water on the east side of Sand Lake Road. And that's an area that we refer to as the East Marsh. That is the area where No Name Creek flows through. And we will be replacing the culvert where No Name Creek crosses Sand Lake Road. That is definitely one feature that backs up water into the marsh there along the east side of Tierra del Mar. There's also several beaver dams, like a number of beaver dams that progressively impound water higher up as you proceed upstream or to the south there. For this project right now, the only thing that we are doing is replacing the culvert at Sand Lake Road. And so I guess that's kind of where I'll stop. At this point, there aren't any plans within this project to do any other drainage improvements on the east side of Sand Lake Road or further south within Tierra del Mar. As Noel mentioned, as part of the, 2022 phase of the project, we did conduct a drainage assessment of Tierra del Mar and was largely focused west of Sand Lake Road, though. And Noel mentioned a lot of, areas, like a lot of the side streets don't have great connectivity to the Sand Lake Road ditch. There's the whole, area is just very flat. And so it just doesn't drain well. On top of that, there's a lot of areas that are closed depressions that just have no outlet. And so those areas do correspond with some of the areas that hold water. Specifically along like Austin Ave has a pretty substantial area. You can see along Holly Ave there, these small pockets, these blue pockets. And then the western portion there, that's kind of its own little sub drainage on the west side of Tierra del Mar. But on the east side, it is mostly the water level and inundation from that East Marsh area, which again is driven largely by a lot of the beaver dam impoundments within that area.
All right, we can open it up to questions from the in-person audience. We've taken care of the online questions. Did you have a question? Okay, that's answered. Anyone else? I'll come to you with the microphone.
Thank you for your time and thank you for the presentation. One of the questions that crosses my mind is I've accessed Sitka sedge a number of times, and I have looked dutifully for this plant and have never found it. I'm curious, will it survive this change? So sometime in the future, I might find it. What's going to happen to the plant Sitka sedge?
Yeah, I can answer that. Right now, its distribution is patchy out there in the marsh, and you have to go out there pretty much in rubber boots to find it. So it's not easily accessible. But what we would expect under the changed hydrology from the project would be that it would be pushed to a new location that has a similar hydrology. And so all of these plants occur, I'm going to call them in bathtub rings at a certain elevation zone in the park. So what is now a Sitka sedge spot niche in the habitat will shift upwards as the tides shift upwards, which will also make it more accessible from the edges. You should be able to find it more easily without having to trudge through the marsh in hip boots.
Thank you. Being a longtime salmon fisherman, I've always been interested in the decline of salmon in the Northwest. And obviously, this is a typical case here that we took a couple of streams that were very productive for coho salmon before my time and turned them into ditches. Have you been any thought of, will we ever get coho salmon going back up Rinky and the other creeks that we're talking about restoring here?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's really a big driver for this project is fish passage, fish access into these habitats. The dike breach, well, starting with the existing culvert that's there now, especially when it had a tide gate on it, that almost fully blocked salmon, coho from entering the marsh and then accessing the creeks. And so the first step along that pathway is relieving that constriction, removing that existing culvert and replacing it with a large breach. That will allow fish access from Sand Lake into the marsh as a whole. And then, as I was just describing, the plans for Reneke Creek itself, which is the highest potential for fish use and where we do see some adult salmon making it to now. That large bridge, that 49-foot span bridge, is also really targeted at improving fish access into Reneke Creek itself. So yeah, big goal for the project. And then Belts Creek as well. You know, as I said, I didn't talk about that much, but we are starting the design of that structure now. The existing culvert that crosses Sand Lake Road has a big perch, a big drop at the outfall. It's about 3 feet. So where water comes out of that culvert, it just drops 3 feet into that channel. And so fish trying to make their way up to Belts Creek would have to make a pretty big leap and then start swimming in this culvert. So that'll be a kind of one of the main reasons for upsizing that structure there. Yeah, thank you.
I have a question. This may be for Chris, if he's still here. I'm curious about the timing for the Belts Creek bridge and all that work in Sand Lake. And also, is that truly separate funding wise and project progress wise from the rest of this? Will that happen regardless of what happens with the rest of the dike restoration?
I think this is a multi-part question. The county is seeking concurrent funding from federal highways for Reneke Creek. Reneke Creek, as you all drive it, that is where it overtops the road. Every single year it just continues to eat up the side of the road. Belts Creek is further up. Thank you. Well, that makes it easier. We are going concurrent to this. We've applied for federal highway aquatic organism passage grant for that. I've asked to try to separate the environmental out. So the NEPA process, National Environmental Protection Agency, which would go through the cultural and everything else. There's a point where we went concurrent with that, which makes sense to the dike, but we also want to continue to push really hard because I can replace that bridge, which is why we funded that 30% design so that we can have enough information there that we can apply for grant funding. So hopefully, knock on wood, we'll get grant funding for that. So if we can build that before the dike, absolutely, we're going to build it before the dike.
Yeah, and just to add to that, you know, I mentioned combining these projects, and that was really so that, you know, our team can work on this all together and also to utilize some of TEP's grant funding that they've obtained to continue advancing Reneke Creek. But as Chris was just saying, you know, there may become a point where we can get Reneke Creek done faster, we can obtain construction funding quicker, and we may break that off to complete that separately.
Any other questions?
I'm wondering again about funding. Is NOAA your primary source of funding, and how do you see it going forward, given that NOAA seems to be at risk of being shut down? Where are your grants coming from? Are they all coming from NOAA or Wells?
I'll bring this over to TEP.
Yeah, and the current grant is a NOAA grant, which, as Colin said, has been restored. We have access to that grant. Yeah, I don't know about the.
Yeah, over the history of the project, there's been a suite of different places where we've gotten grant funding. That includes NOAA. There have been some EPA dollars for a coastal watershed grant. There have been some state lottery funds through the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board that have also come in towards this project. But yeah, NOAA is, for a project of this scope, you know, $6 million, there's not a lot of places that can fund that kind of pot of money. NOAA is one of the ones that really can do that. You know, if I can't really speak to the likelihood of what granting agencies are going to look like in the coming months and years, but you know, this is a project that's really important, and no matter what the funding environment looks like, we're going to keep pushing forward to try and get it done.
Sorry, can you repeat that for the people online?
If NOAA goes away, where do you go? And you mentioned the EPA that is also in peril at this time?
Sure. That's a question that I think we're going to have to answer when we get there. I can't predict what exactly is going to happen to NOAA. There are other funding sources. Fish and Wildlife Service has some wetland protection sources that we could look into. Yeah. I can't predict the future on this one.
The OWEB funds seem like a possibility.
OWEB funds are certainly a possibility. That would be a matter of scale. They do have some pots of money that are large enough to do a project like this, but those tend to be reserved for focused investment partnerships and other things that expect quite large other projects. But it is a potential opportunity and a source to look towards.
More questions? All right. Well, we might actually get out of here on time then. That's amazing. Thank you.